Hey guys, and welcome to the Lunge Lift podcast. Today, Ash and myself are discussing when does poor movement become a problem. We want to cover what compensation patterns actually are, why do they happen, what are some common compensation patterns, and what we can do about them. But before we get started, I just wanted to let you guys know that we are sponsored by Wit Fitness. So you can head over to their website now, wit-fitness.com, grab yourself some apparel, use the code LL15 to save 15% off. That's 5% more than you get for signing up to the newsletter. And tag us on Insta at lunge.lift with all your apparel buys, and we look forward to seeing them. So Ash, let's get into the serious stuff. Compensation patterns. So when does poor movement become a bit of a problem? What is a compensation?
Good question. And I enjoyed thinking about this one. And I think if you distill it down, a compensation pattern is when the body changes strategy to something that's suboptimal to complete its task. That's quite philosophical, but essentially, you could design optimal mechanics for any movement for somebody's proportions and current state. So something that's important to factor in is that everyone is different. Everyone has different proportions in their limb lengths and side biases. So there is a best way to do things theoretically. However, in real life, perfect doesn't really exist. So your body's always just trying to find the best way to achieve its task. So if you start to fatigue or a certain muscle fatigues, you get an injury, you've got pain that you're trying to avoid, your body will have a workaround to do it a different way. And that's essentially the birth of a compensation pattern, when it realizes there's more than one strategy it can employ to achieve its task. It could be hitting a tennis ball, it could be deadlifting a weight. Any movement pattern, there's a few different ways that the goal of striking that ball or lifting that weight could be achieved. And the thing we're going to dive into today is, if that strategy changes, how much does it have to deviate from optimal before it actually becomes a problem? And I think it's going to be an interesting chat, hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. So just on that, so thinking about overall mechanics, and you mentioned there about when, say, performing a task and your body, say, gets tired, and then it moves to then a new movement pattern, so like still complete the task and complete it to the best of its abilities. So this kind of then makes me think the importance of understanding how to perform a movement and introducing intensity slowly. So when we talk about CrossFit, and a lot of it is a lot of reps over time, and say for instance doing 50 toes to bar in a workout. Now, if you are not, like when we had Jamie on and he mentioned he had to do a workout in like 2s or 3s, that meant, I presume, he was doing that because that was where he was able to keep his movement pattern correct and efficient before it actually break down unnecessarily, and it'll start to utilize other muscles. Now, where this goes is using other muscles a problem if you're not getting injured? Now, I know that's very broad because at what point does the injury then occur, and how do you know it's then linked to that? But is it a problem using these suboptimal movement patterns?
No, as a overall answer,
Yeah.
I think your body is never using perfectly optimized mechanics. So there's always going to be some degree to which there can be improvement. So as a blanket statement, because we're never moving perfectly, it's not always going to be a problem. I think it is a gray area as to when it does become a problem. For like toes to bar, you've actually just got me thinking about it now, is a great example because you can use different muscles differently, but still move well. So depending on what workout you're in, there's like, when I break it down for people learning toes to bar, there's essentially two styles of toes to bar. There's a lat dominant toes to bar and an ab dominant toes to bar. So if you're very strong in your upper body and you can close that shoulder angle forcefully, you can mainly use your shoulders and your lats without having to do too much work with your abs and flexing the hip. Equally, if you're very strong through the midline and not so strong through the lats, you can do more of a leg raise, create a sharper hip flexion angle, and achieve toes to bar that way round. And people have a natural tendency to prefer one or the other, depending on where they're strong and where they're weak. Both of them are fine. Both of them use big, strong muscles to achieve the task. And depending on what the workout context is, one might be favorable. Like if it's a toes to bar and chest to bar workout, you might want to save your lats and shoulders for the chest to bar. But if it's a toes to bar and a GHD workout, then you might want to save your abs and use a more lat dominant toes to bar technique. So just because the muscles being used are slightly different, that doesn't definitely mean that there's a problem. However, if you're starting to use your rotator cuff muscles to do your kipping instead of your lats, then that is going to be a problem because the rotator cuff muscles are comparatively tiny and are not strong enough to control your body weight for multiple reps of swinging on a bar at speed.
That's a physio's favorite thing for new CrossFitters, isn't it? So I'll tell you something though, so when you have that particular movement, so I guess that boils down to the question which we always bring up, is in like why, like what is the task at hand that you have to complete, which you mentioned there. So having two different techniques of the same movement that dominate more one movement pattern than the other is a good thing to have in your arsenal. So that's why it's obviously good to practice both of them. But also then, even if it's not a workout where you need to use one or the other, you can use either because it's not really going to be too much of a detrimental thing. It's also a good thing to understand that you have then a different movement pattern to perform the same task when you get tired. So because otherwise, when you start getting tired, this is then when you go into those compensation patterns that even though you have two options you can go between, because you've exhausted one, you then don't have the other one anymore because you've just gone so far over the cliff, that over past that line, that now you're going to go into those suboptimal compensation patterns. So why, apart from obviously just going too far, why do they happen?
Yeah, I think in my mind, there's two main reasons. There's either habits or injuries. So like we're always forming habits. Like we always say, you're always training something. So whatever you're doing, your body's adapting to it and preparing to be better at it next time. That could be being sat down on your sofa doing a podcast, or it could be standing on one leg when I had a client who made wedding cakes, and the setup in the bakery was that the table she would dress the cake on was on one side of her body. So she's always leaning over that way, loading one leg, being in a slight side bend, which resulted in shoulder issues. So that's a habit that's making her life easier when doing the cakes. But when it comes to training in the gym or doing sport, it's not such a beneficial habit or adaptation to have. So just being conscious that whatever you've done in the past and whatever you've done a lot of is going to have changed your body in some way, shape or form. And that might be a poor adaptation for other activities that you like to do. So typically, your non-gym life versus your gym life, or your non-sporting life versus your sporting life. You're potentially asking conflicting things of your body from a habits point of view. So the other classic example of this is if you're a rower and you row on one side of the boat, one side of your body is going to be very different to the other. You then come to squat or deadlift, and you're asking both sides of your body to do exactly the same thing, but one side moves very differently to the other, one side's stronger than the other, and that's not a great situation to be in.
So just before we move on to injuries, there's that. I think this also then goes back to our podcast when we talk about flexibility, stability and stuff like that, because even though that, say the person doing the wedding cake, they had no problem saying like a bit of a shoulder issue, which obviously you said about like from training, but generally their life always gone over on one side and their body's adapted to that. It's the same as like why you say we don't need to necessarily be able to touch our toes. If like when do we need to, if we're training, why is touching our toes a goal? Or why should it even be a goal? If you squat perfectly and deadlift perfectly, say, and press perfectly, is touching your toes a thing? And I was talking about this with a client today, and he was just a bit like, I'm feeling just a little bit tighter than normal, and can't touch my toes at the moment. I said, but why is that your measure? Like, and he did say, okay, yeah, I've been sitting down a lot more recently, and I normally use my stand-up desk. So like he had, things have changed, and he just said he's not been feeling as good, and he's just like, he's going his way back in. But it just reminded me, I think, like I said, about the habits, as in like you asking yourself, like, what task is it at hand that you have to deal with, and in your day-to-day life, it might be completely fine. But then you put yourself into an unnatural state, which normally is training. You're asking your body to do so much more. It's like, which one's the right state? Is training the right way, or is your day-to-day life the right way? Training is potentially, you say, 1 hour of your day, whereas the rest of your day is 23. So what's saying your 1 hour is correct and your 23 is wrong?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So imagine she was perfectly symmetrical and gym was good, but then the 8 hours of working on cakes, she was in pain. Like she'd probably rather be pain-free doing cakes than in the gym.
So I guess then, as you say then, so the other way it can happen is obviously injuries. And I think this is a really common one that you see, especially a lot with, like, say, ex-athletes at whatever level coming into, especially something like CrossFit, when you see a lot of rugby lads coming into CrossFit and their bodies have to compensate all over the shop because of how they've been hit left, right and centre.
Exactly. So if you've had any like level of tissue damage, then your body is going to have avoided loading it, at least during the period that it was painful and healing. And depending on how well it healed and how good your rehab was, you may have some residual lack of range of motion, tenderness, or any sort of dysfunction. You might even have the opposite. You might have laxity. So if you've had ligament damage, you might have joints that just move too far now and are unstable. But whatever the thing that has changed is, your body is going to have adapted to continue achieving its tasks and work around that. So it could be as simple as you've broken your leg, you're on crutches for a little while, and now your body doesn't like loading that leg because for a few weeks or months you taught it to load the other leg, and that's the way you just go about life. Over time, you continue to bed in that adaptation because, say, you broke your left leg, you're on crutches, you're leaning on your right leg for a few months, and your right leg gets stronger in that period of time. You've had some atrophy on the left leg muscles, and you get back to normal life. Every step you're now taking, you're probably leaning a little bit onto the right leg because it is stronger and more stable. And because you're leaning onto the right leg while you're walking, it's getting even stronger and probably more stable as well. You then start training at the gym and you're doing your squats, you're doing your deadlifts, leaning onto that right leg again, and it exacerbates that compensation pattern. And to start with, it was very subtle because it was, just a couple of weeks, a couple of months, just on crutches, not much load going through the non-injured leg. But over time, it does compound, and without proper rehab or an intervention, that's how one compensation pattern can turn into many, because you're loading your right leg more. When you squat, you're probably going to have some upstream compensations when you overhead squat, because to stay balanced and keep the bar straight, your thoracic spine is probably going to have to do something to avoid just falling to the right every single lift. And it can be like super complicated, and unpicking those is probably one of my favorite things to do, just to see the root from how a left ankle injury has resulted in right shoulder pain. Like those sorts of things can and do happen. But yeah, that's essentially a very long-winded answer to your question for why do compensation patterns happen. Your body is essentially working around a situation, whether it's through injury or through habit, to find a way to achieve the task, which diverges from optimal movement mechanics.
Yeah, I think, like, especially when you utilize it into, say, actual movements in particular, so especially with like a deadlift. So you mentioned before in like this is actually really good. Sorry, this is now just made me think. The episode back a couple where we spoke about accessory training and stuff like that, and we spoke about it's not wrong to do more reps on your weaker side or something like that. So this is like an optimal time to, if say using this right leg and left leg, so you're dominating your right leg, is to do more left-sided accessory training, because that side needs to build up strength, it needs to do more reps, it needs to build up better stability and just essentially movement mechanics. So yeah, it just how my brain was thinking. I was thinking that's actually a really good one. And also we've done the episode obviously on muscle imbalances. So if you haven't listened to those episodes, guys, do listen back. Because they've just come to me, I haven't got what number they were to me. But yeah, so give me some examples of why do they happen. So would you be able to give some, maybe using something like a deadlift as an example?
Yeah, so deadlifts is a great example. Say somebody's very poor at using their hips and hamstrings because they do an office job and they're sat down all day. Their head is thinking, I need to get this weight off the floor and stand up. Because the hips and hamstrings aren't doing that much, they'll find the strength from somewhere else, typically lower back. And this is why people might have a slightly rounded back deadlift. They're trying to load the muscles of the back more to create the force that's missing from the glutes and hamstrings. So getting an overloaded QL and like spinal erector muscles is very normal compensation pattern people might find when they're doing a deadlift. While we're on topic of deadlifts, actually, just sort of another way to look at compensation patterns. Because you're adapting for one thing, what makes you good at that one thing might make you bad at another thing. And I think we've talked about this before when we're talking about Eddie Hall and his 500 kilo deadlift. He'll have a phenomenally stiff back, which is an adaptation which allows a great deadlift, but that could be viewed as a compensation pattern for other areas, other movements. So something that involves a lot of spinal extension, he'll struggle with. And there's been a big trade-off made there. So he'll have to compensate with another area of his body to find that extension. So perhaps he'll be hypermobile in his shoulders or his thoracic spine if he's trying to achieve global extension with, like a big overhead press, or like if you're going to go to the extreme, like a yoga back bend. Just the idea of him doing a yoga back bend is pretty ludicrous, right? But equally, somebody who is adapted for back bends in yoga will struggle to find the stiffness in their spine to perform a heavy deadlift. So they might compensate elsewhere, either with a round back deadlift or overusing a different tissue. So in that one movement, we've seen a few different examples of where work can be done by different areas of the body, which you could argue are suboptimal. But for that person in that exact moment in time, that was the most efficient way for them to do it.
And this obviously boils down to is like, at what point does it become wrong? And it's like keeping with the deadlift, and it's like, so sometimes you see a lot of strongmen a lot more quad dominant with their deadlifts. They're just lifted such massive amounts, and then quads, then the glutes and hamstrings will kick in and the back and stuff like that. Whereas a powerlifter, a lot of time you'll see it's a lot more glutes and hamstrings, and then their back will start to kick in. And it's like, I think this comes into the point where the rounded back on the deadlift gets hammered. But at the same time, even though it can take a shed ton of load, and it's strong as fuck, but surely the hamstrings and glutes are so much bigger that they can take so much more that you then want to utilize the back with the last, say, 10% when you're really having to use it, rather than saying, right, I'm going to use my back to pick up this weight. Because that's just saying my opinion and my thoughts, that's not going to be good long term. No matter whatever, like whether you're a yogi or a strongman and stuff like that, it's like bigger muscles can take more force and more pressure and just more stress. So why in anything would you stress a smaller area that is essentially going to deteriorate quicker?
Really good. Yeah, I love this. So well, I guess the question you're asking is when is it a problem? At its simplest, if it holds back performance or creates pain and injury. So those are the two main reasons. It's what no one cares about the movement mechanics or prehab exercises until they've had an injury. So almost until that point, you can almost I say you can, I'm not saying you should, but people just do what they want until it becomes a problem because they've plateaued performance-wise or they're now in pain. Taking it to that deadlift example, you said, why would you want to do a round back deadlift? And it's not dissimilar to the knee valgus discussion. Your body's rounding its back to lengthen the muscles of the back to create extra strength. And some people think that you're either using your back or you're using your glutes and hamstrings, when actually if you want to lift the heaviest weight possible, you want to use as much musculature as possible. So if you are getting the most out of your glutes and hamstrings, then maybe adding in the back as well means you can lift even more. So when you're looking to break world records, you want to get as many muscles in as you can, provided none of those muscles are overloaded. And the way I like to think about it is like all your muscles are like teammates on a team, and you want everyone to pull their weight in proportion. So if the glutes and hams are the biggest muscles on your body, then you want them doing most of the work. But that doesn't mean you don't want the back doing any work. It still needs to chip in and contribute. The issues happen when the weaker team members are trying to take on the jobs of the stronger team members, and they then get overloaded. Equally, like it's not as common, but the strong team member, I don't know why I just call them muscles. The stronger muscles can do too much work as well, but it is less common. And like overuse is just overuse, whether it's a big muscle or a small muscle. So I think it's an interesting thing to dive into, because people are always looking for absolutes and like this is always the case, and it is different. Like the way you'd coach Eddie Hall to pull his heaviest deadlift versus somebody doing a deadlift for the first time are very different, and having that nuance around it, I think a lot of people can just get more of what they want out of their training. Because as always, ask yourself why you're doing the exercise in the first place. Why are you giving it to your client? What's the intended stimulus? And once you're clear on that, you can make a decision on whether a slight rounding of the back is a problem, or is an extreme rounding of the back a problem. And
I think with, so I want to stick with this deadlift thing, because I think it's such an easy idea for most people to think about, because I think everyone's seen what they say is a really bad deadlift with someone essentially craning a weight up and so forth. And I think where I want to kind of just make clear with this is, yes, utilizing the back, and you'll see some of the best deadlifts, like the back will start to get involved. And as we say, it's not a problem, but it's when you're not utilizing the glutes and the hamstrings, and that's where the problem comes. And this is then where it's, even though we're not all going to move exactly the same, we should all look something similar along the lines of. And that, as you say, it's like, this is then where coaching experience and like just being able to look at someone and say, okay, this is probably not good because you can see this is happening. Or as you said, performance or injury happens. Like performance, obviously, it doesn't increase, or then you get injured. So it's making sure you have those essentially stats to work off and in your library. So then, cool, okay, I'm not getting, this isn't causing me pain, and my deadlift is constantly increasing, then fine. But that doesn't then mean you're necessarily doing it right. It just means you haven't reached your potential for that, where your back has had to work too much. And I think this reminded me, actually. So I went swimming the other day in the morning. And so it was in a 6:30, because it's 45 minutes a month because of COVID. They're just, 45 minutes in and out and done. So 6:30 in the morning, you've got people that swim very well. Like I'm there stopping every 50, dying, just like watching these overweight people just not stop, and these old people just not stop. I'm like, I am doing something very wrong here. And I was watching someone, and she was essentially moving like a snake in the water. Now, I even though I don't know swimming that well, I know what's kind of right and what's kind of wrong. And this kind of made me think about when we said about the compensation patterns. It's like her body now, instead of rotating, is going side to side. And it just looked wrong. But was it wrong? And this is kind of like when it goes down to that, when does poor movement become a problem? Because it's not loaded. She's able to just move through the water, and she's able to move better than me continuously. Not saying that I am the benchmark, but it's just like, how can I judge her? So is she wrong for continuing to swim like that? Or should she address that, or should she just carry on with that?
Yeah, great question. I think it opens up a few different questions. I think if we keep it as simple as possible, is it is her performance continuing to improve? We'll have to find out if she tracks her training and is she getting what she wants out of her training. Potentially, she's just happy to go for a few lengths every morning, and that's just nice. And she's not. And the second question is she in pain or is she moving towards pain? Is that difference in technique eventually going to lead to overuse of a tissue that's not really designed to deal with that workload? If she's getting what she wants out of her training and there's no sort of pathology in her future by continuing with that pattern, then go for it. Like, golf swings are a beautiful example of this, in that you can swing a golf club in so many different ways. If it hits the ball straight and it's not causing you pain, just like crack on. And obviously I'm not seeing this lady swim.
So before you go on from that, you say that, but then doesn't that then go back to the deadlift example where you're saying, like, if you round your back and lift up a weight with a rounded back continually and it doesn't cause you any problems, then you're just going to keep going until you get injured, right? Because that's the golf swing. Then if you keep hitting it straight and then suddenly, oh bang, you now have busted back, and then you obviously have to. So it's but where this kind of then comes to, especially with that woman swimming, it comes to the thing of, don't judge a book by its cover. You have to know. So when you see someone else in the gym, or you see someone, you don't know what imbalances they're working with. You don't know what conversations they're having to work for. Like, there's so much that you don't know unless you know this person's exercise history, you know this person's their day and everything about them. Don't assume straight away that it's wrong. And so don't go up to them saying, oh, you should do this. It's like, so and a good example is when we're coaching, and we've coached classes before and stuff like that, and it's, you have a general rule of thumb, which you know roughly things should look like X, and if they're too far out of that range, you go over and normally help and something like that. And then we know some more specifics about someone, you can spend a little bit more time with that. But you know a global idea that you're looking at it and say, right, cool, everyone in this room looks like they're doing it roughly okay and they're not going to get hurt. So now let's go and fine tune some people's technique and help them specifically with the task that they need to improve upon.
Yeah. I think, you've pulled out the key nuance there, is that the variation technique is fine, provided that there's no like red flags in that technique. So a slight rounding of the back in the deadlift is fine if the glutes and hamstrings are getting loaded and all the major muscle groups are in, and there's no like massive kinks in the spine, so like one disc isn't taking all of the work, and it's not a massive rounding in the lower back, which is much more problematic than a slight rounding from the thoracic spine. So there's a lot of caveats around that. So it's not just a broad brush blanket statement to say round back deadlifts are all fine and just crack on until it hurts. It's provided that fundamental prerequisites are in place. There's a lot of variation in performing a standard movement that is actually acceptable and might not cause any problems whatsoever. So for this lady swimming, obviously, we need to do a proper analysis to see if there's anything fundamentally wrong, but a little bit more lateral flexion and side bending while she's doing front crawl, because she potentially misses a bit of rotation, might not lead to overuse of any muscles or tissues at all, potentially. And in which case, there's no need to change her technique. But if there's one vertebrae disc relationship which is doing all of that movement, then it would lead to a degenerative overuse, and it would then benefit her to restore more rotation.
Okay, so I think for the listeners, it'd be really beneficial maybe if we run through some common compensation patterns and maybe what we can do about them. So let's start with, say, something like squatting. So what's a common compensation pattern when squatting that you've seen?
I think like the squat and the deadlift are very related in that they're distinct movement patterns, or the squat and the hinge, I prefer to say, in that one is knee flex, the degree of knee flexion is the separator. So for me, if there's a predominance of vertical displacement down, so your hips are lowering towards the floor, that's a squat movement. Whereas if the hips aren't really displacing downwards and they're more shifting backwards, you've got a posterior translation, that's a hinge dominant movement. There's always a degree of both. Like in normal movement, the hip and the knee flex together. It's just the degree to which one flexes more than the other, which would typify a squat or a hinge pattern. But you talked about it earlier. Perfect example for strongmen deadlifting. It's quite squatty. Like they bend their knees quite a lot. Like Eddie Hall comes out of nearly like a parallel or deeper squat before he then does his deadlift. So there's no absolute ratios of when one becomes the other. But for some people, it depends why you're doing the exercise always. So I'm just like littering this with caveats. But if you're giving somebody a RDL, Romanian deadlift, or a deadlift, a normal deadlift even, because you want to train their hip hinge and you want to train their posterior chain, but their knees are shooting forwards, then they're turning what you want to be a hip hinge posterior chain exercise into a squat. And that might not be wrong if they're a strong man maxing out their deadlift like that. That's the perfect example. And it might be stronger for them, but they're not getting the training stimulus that you want. So that's a common compensation pattern of shifting towards a squat dominant pattern because you're maybe stronger in your quads rather than your posterior chain, versus shifting your hips backwards and loading those glutes and hamstrings to train the hinge. And it's a really common one you see for people who sit down for work because they're just reluctant to load that posterior chain. So when things start to get difficult, they just want to shoot the knees forward to get the strength from their quads. And like I say, that's not necessarily wrong, but there's a whole host of things that could happen upstream of that. Like it's quite often paired with overloading the back as well in a deadlift. So that's probably number one on my list of common compensation patterns. It carries over to weightlifting as well. That's really important when people can't get their knees out of the way on the Olympic lifts to keep a vertical bar path.
This kind of reminds me though, when you talk about the squatting and hinging, is like when I back squat, I quite tend to favour the low bar back squat because it's a lot more posterior. So it is more of a hinge because I've got a strong hinge. So again, my goal is to lift the most amount of weight, say while the weight's on my shoulders. So using a hinge rather than a squat necessarily is better. Whereas if I have really good ankle range of motion, and so someone like Gus, previous guest, he had great ankle range of motion, he can get into a high bar back squat and it pretty much look like a front squat because he's got such good flexion at the ankles that he can get to that position, whereas I don't have that same range. So for me, it's not a stronger position. So it's like then you have to ask, what is the intended use of the squat? Is it to build, say, quads? Then why are you just doing a squat, for instance? Why not do maybe something a bit more specific for the quads? Or if you're trying to use it, find the max amount of weight to move as possible, then maybe you have to find what's best for you. And if a low bar or more hinge dominant squat is better, then that's fine. But there's nothing right or wrong. And I think we're going to always come back to it, is this: don't tarnish everyone with that same brush. Everyone has to, we've mentioned this in previous episodes, that not everyone has to squat the same, because they won't squat the same, especially with a barbell, because we all have these like imbalances or these restrictions that a barbell will probably highlight massively because it's an immovable object. So it means we have to compensate somewhere else because we're holding a weight somewhere it doesn't want to be. So
yeah, great example. And I think, well, probably to move on to the next typical common compensation patterns, sticking with the bilateral lifts, single side dominance, super simple, but ever present. I don't know anyone who's not slightly biased towards one side because we're usually one hand dominant. Well, we're always one hand dominant. Everyone does most things with one hand, even if they're pretty ambidextrous. Your body has a preference to do certain things with a certain side. And like you say, with a barbell, there's no hiding because it is a symmetrical loading tool. So your body is going to organize itself to lift it in the easiest way possible, which probably means using the stronger side a little bit more. And as a diagnostic tool, it's great because it's a straight object. So it makes it very easy to see any tilts. So if one side goes higher than the other, and any rotations as well. So those compensations in a different plane of motion. Also, if you look at a bar side on, when someone's lifting it, does it move off plane? Does it go forwards or back? And you can also see it rotates if you look at the ends of the bar. So that single side dominance is, it's always there. It's just the degree to which it affects performance or pain. So again, like once you start looking for it, you'll see it in everyone. I remember when I started doing movement assessments and diagnosing squats, and I would teach a class, see 20 people squatting, and I was like, this is like a horror show. It's like everyone's all over the place. And then you realize actually it doesn't matter. Like everyone has it. And it's only if it's very major that it'll become an issue.
So this kind of, I think, goes into a thought that I have that is it might even come from you, or I might be completely wrong altogether. But so using the stronger side and weaker side as the main thing here. So someone that's right-footed, so using me as an example, right? I'm right-footed, so I'm stronger on my right, and like kick a football, everything's through my right side through my whole life. Now my left side is then more stable because I've always had to stabilize myself on my left side compared to my right side. So this is then a little bit of a question to you. Does that tend to mean that the stronger side is normally the more unstable side because it's able to muscle things compared to the weaker side? Because my left side, I always feel, and I notice with clients as well, it's like my left side has better, it just works better, but it's not as strong because it can't just find this compensation pattern to just get through that muscle through. So my left has to work more efficiently to work as hard. So do you know kind of where I'm going with that?
I know exactly. Right? Yeah.
Ish?
Yeah, it is. So it's interesting to say it has to work more efficiently to work as hard. So I might flip that around a little bit and say the strong side is more dysfunctional because it gets overused. Injuries usually happen on the side that does more work rather than less work. So even though your right leg is stronger, because you're going to use it more at every given opportunity, it's then more likely to develop a secondary compensation pattern because it has to find another strategy to get the job done. So let's just dig into that squat example. Like say you're squatting away and your right leg's stronger. So you're doing a tough set, you're getting close to failure. Now your right leg main muscles, so your glutes and your quads, let's say, are reaching their breaking point, they're building up fatigue, and they literally are about to fail, but your body's like, I still need to stand this bar up. Where else can I find some strength from? So that right leg that's now doing most of the work has a problem. It's like, I need to find some strength in somewhere else. My glutes and my quads have had it. So that's where you might start using your adductor or one of the smaller muscles around the hip to just find that extra bit of power to finish that rep. So you are achieving the task. You've been successful in achieving the task, but you're now using suboptimal, in air quotes, muscle loading patterns to achieve it. So what we normally see, and I'd say like 95+% of cases, is the strong side is where the problems are. So that left side, it's been on holiday. It's like not had to do much work. So why would it have to change its movement patterns? And we usually see that weak side is less dysfunctional from a muscle sequencing point of view.
Nice. So yeah, that's what I thought, because I always found that it's like a single leg deadlift as an example. My left side, I can single leg deadlift relatively well, relatively comfortably. Yet my right foot, I'm just like wobbling, and I've broken my left ankle and stuff like that. So I've caused my left side problems, but because it's had my whole life, it's had 32 years of stabilizing all my weight, so I can, even though I don't play football much, but it's in doing everything with my right side. It's just like it's just crazy. Then the compensations that happen along the way that aren't even necessarily a problem, but as we say, when you then identify them under the load of a barbell as an example, so I know when I squat, I know my hips shift because I have that imbalance where my right side is stronger. So, and I think that then leads us on to slightly like plane compensation. So as we said there, my hips shift when I squat because of my right leg is stronger. So what are maybe some of the things that also happen there?
Yeah, plane compensation. So just to explain it a little bit further, when I say plane compensation, I mean there are 3 planes of motion. So you've got sagittal, which is forward, back, up and down motion, frontal or coronal, which is left to right, and then transverse, which is rotating left or right. And the body has loads of quirks and innovative strategies for achieving its task. And one of them is borrowing from planes. So if you're not very good at one plane of motion, you'll use the other two, or predominantly one, more to achieve the same task. So we could class that lady you saw at the pool with her more side bending as a plane compensation, because she's using more frontal plane to create space to get her front crawl going, versus transverse plane rotation. So that is a classic plane compensation. And the hip shift you're talking about in your squat is very related to a hip shift you might see in somebody running, where it's a sideways movement. So the hips are essentially moving more to the outside of the working leg to get stretch on the lateral hip. So glute med is a common muscle, or this is where people get ITB issues as well. The outside of the thigh is getting loaded more because something else isn't getting loaded enough. So commonly people can't access their glute max, the biggest, strongest muscle in the body, in the transverse plane. So they're not getting enough internal rotation of that hip. And because they're not getting enough internal rotation, they have to find stretch, power, stability from somewhere else. So they'll move to a different part of the hip to try and to get what it needs to achieve the task. So the side to side rock of a runner's hips could be because they don't have enough internal rotation of that hip. And if they improved that, or they stiffened up the lateral hip, then they might be able to access that and move a little bit more efficiently without so much side to side movement, which isn't getting them where they want to go.
So I think also another area which common compensation issues is arms and shoulders, like that sort of area. So can we just dive in a little bit into that? Because obviously we don't want to utilize arms straight away, especially with things like pull-ups, do we? And because obviously you're Mr. Pull-Up, so can you dive a bit more into that bit?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is an example where gymnasts have elegantly simplified the discussion of it, where they distinguish between straight arm strength and bent arm strength, and that straight arm strength should precede and exceed bent arm strength. And if you look at advanced gymnastics or calisthenics movements like levers, they're always with straight arms. But if you get somebody who's done a lot of gym work and is good at pull-up, like normal pull-ups, they'll always do them with bent arms. And I'd class that, like myself included, I'd class that as a compensation pattern where you're trying to use arm muscles to do shoulder muscles jobs, because at that moment in time, they're more skilled and potentially stronger than those shoulder muscles that should be controlling the movement. And this manifests really commonly in CrossFitters trying to get their first muscle ups, and they don't give themselves enough of a chance by continuing the straight arm kip, and they're just trying to pull with their arms too soon because that's where they feel strong and that's where they feel in control. So it's either trusting the range with the straight arms or developing the strength with the straight arms to finish the kip and get the most out of the shoulders, because that longer lever is more powerful if you can harness it correctly. But it's just a really typical common compensation that people want to use their arms. The same in weightlifting, like keeping your arms straight to finish the pull has a better transfer of force into the bar than having bent arms and adding in that sort of like shock absorber effect. And it's because people feel subconsciously more in control with a bent arm, and their body is again using its currently thought best strategy to achieve the task at hand.
It's funny because it's normally where you do all this perfect technique all the way up to your 1 rep max, and then you're going to go, right, I'm now going to change everything and do this completely different, because this is what's going to get this way over here. And I am a massive like component of it. I know I did that. So I've remembered it, mate, and so many people do, because we associate these loads with like, right, this is now the one. This is where I need to do this special thing. It's like, no, if you're ready for it. So when I hit my 130 snatch, I didn't know what I was putting on the bar. I was putting on, and I had an idea, but I made sure every one, I was just like not thinking and just putting on, and just until it got to the point. Then as soon as I knew it was 130, because I had this gut feeling, I put on. So this is how I knew. I was going up in fives, And then as soon as I put on 2.5 on the on total, so 1.25 on each side, I knew I was at 130. So then I did a very different pull for that exact reason, and I was just like, oh, for fuck's. And it's funny because when we're talking about these like conversations, and I think a lot of this comes from then overuse. This is where a lot of the problems come from, overuse. And an example is, so I went down to WIT on Thursday, and I was snatching with Jordan, and I said to him, it's funny, I don't feel my snap and my strength has gone too much from, even though all my endurance training is like, I've still got a good amount of strength there, but I'm extremely lazy in my technique and it's just poor. And I saw someone doing banded muscle ups, and I was like, I wonder if I can still do a muscle up. So what did I do? Went over to a bar, did a muscle up, went over to the rings, did a muscle up, and I could just feel my right shoulder. And it's like, but the thing is, it wasn't pain, but I knew that was just because you said about the straight arm strength. That it's like, I know I did a form of kip, but I definitely pulled way too early just to get. It wasn't inefficient movement, and as a one-off, you probably get away with it, like I did there. But the problem is when we're talking about things like this, is when it happens on a repetitive basis. That when you're not, using your straight arm strength, say for a muscle up. Your shoulders are going to overwork massively because it's just not going to be a good time for endurance for like the amount for multiple reps.
Yeah, exactly. It's that step away from optimal mechanics. So in that moment in time, your body thinks that using its arms more is going to achieve the task better and more easily. And that might even be true because at that moment in time, you can't use your lats because you haven't got the skill to use them or the activation or whatever reason it is. So in that moment in time, it's the right decision for your body to do it. But
probably shouldn't
this
have
is
done it
where,
in the first place.
this is where movement mechanics, corrective exercise is just technique work. It is the same thing. You're trying to use your body most efficiently to achieve the task. And through coaching, you will learn to use your shoulders and your lats, and that will ultimately make that movement even more efficient. And it's why people's first muscle up is always a bit ugly. It's why 1 rep max are quite often ugly. So you're just trying to use whatever you can to achieve the task in any way. But when you're looking to increase volume or increase performance, ironing out the kinks and fine-tuning your technique is beneficial from both an injury prevention and a performance point of view. But it just takes a little bit of guidance for your body and your nervous system to get there.
I think, and you can also probably then go back to a previous episode we did on training versus competing, and it's that same thing as understanding that time of when to go to those places where you can end yourself, but it's like most of the time you need to be in that training state where you're getting better and improving. So obviously we've thrown out quite a few examples and so forth, but what can our listeners do about them, and since they are common?
Yep. So I guess the first thing is identify them. Everyone's going to have them to some degree. It's just, is there a problem? So is your training plateauing? Is there something major happening that you're worried about? Are you experiencing pain? If there is a problem, then identifying where it comes from. So filming yourself, getting people to review your technique to see if there's anything striking going on, and then have a think about what you're trying to achieve from the movement and how that compensation pattern could be limiting what you want out of the movement. So it's trying to be as generalistic as possible so it can apply to as many circumstances as possible. But everyone's got a limiter in their exercise, whether it's aerobic exercise, whether it's strength exercise, whatever. There's going to be something that stops you, that is the major limiter to you up leveling your performance. And if your movement mechanics stop you recruiting your muscles, the major muscles, well, you need to figure out exactly what that is. So is it that you're not getting anything out of your left leg and actually your squats plateaued for a long period of time? Could it be as simple as just doing more left leg loading to get your left leg closer to your right leg in terms of strength? Or could it be that your right leg is unstable compared to your left, and stabilizing your right leg is going to be the low-hanging fruit that means you can take your performance to the next level? So that's the most important part, is just identifying what aspect of the exercise is the limiter. It could just be as simple as not enough volume, like you're not training enough or hard enough. Once you've got an idea of what that might be, comparing it to what good looks like. So look at what more optimal technique is. Like we said earlier, there's room for debate as to what perfect is, but success leaves clues. So if you want to squat like the best squatters in the world, get on YouTube, watch clips of the Olympics, watch clips of powerlifting meets, and see what they're doing that you're not doing, or what you're doing and that they're not doing, and see where those gaps are. It could be as simple, like golfers are amazing at this in terms of split screen, just have your swing on the left, have Tiger's swing on the right, and just see, like, step through frame by frame, what are the gaps. So the game is spot the difference. And you've obviously got to be careful with who you select as your role model for movement. But if they perform better than you and they have less injuries than you, then they're probably a good starting point. And then it's just a question of trying to play matchy and get your technique looking like their technique. Simple as that.
I think as well, it is really important to then understand, when we've mentioned about what do you need to prioritize, because like you said with your wedding cake person, do you want to be in pain for 8 hours of your day compared to 1 hour of your day? And is in where's the, like, at what point do you need to decide, okay, cool, this is what now needs work and so forth? And not saying that you then shouldn't try to improve on that 1 hour of the day, but understand that the balance and that there's more to it. So basically that's the thing. It's like, as you said, we're not all going to be perfect. We're not all going to move perfectly, but we've all developed these compensations throughout our lives, and it's then to understand, cool, okay, I might not become the best whatever because I don't have the time to work on continual improvement in, say, with that, say the wedding cake person, say as the example, like obviously she had a shoulder injury, so that was then something that got worked on because of that. So it's just basically just understanding priorities, and also if you do have any issues, then find a coach. Like we've got one here, Ash, we've got myself. We can help out, and it's like, we can look into the finite details and maybe understand where the problems are coming from, where they stem, and then you don't have to live in pain. Basically, that's the thing that we want to try and obviously kind of gear towards. But anything else to add, Ash?
No, I think that's plenty from me today.
Yeah, it really is. So thanks a lot, mate. Really did appreciate that. I hope you guys enjoyed listening. It's been a very insightful episode for me as well. As always, if you do enjoy it, please do leave us a review on iTunes. It does help us get discovered. And you can also find us on YouTube as well. The Lunge Lift channel is there. Apart from that, really appreciate your time, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.